and a lot of people say this a lot when they, in reference to great musicians, like when they say like it doesn't matter the situation, it doesn't matter what they play, it's always gonna work and it's gonna sound good. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So that's how I felt when I was playing with them. It's like
Okay.
they were just breathing the music. You know, and it's like that level of freedom where it was just like it didn't matter. It didn't matter complexity. It didn't matter whatever it was. They were gonna impact the music
Yeah.
and just be free within it. So once I saw that, I was like, that's what I want.
Welcome to Keep Taking Ground, the Saxophone podcast. I'm your host, Jesse Ryan, and today's guest is a multiple Grammy nominee and Guggenheim and MacArthur Fellowship. He represents a select group of musicians who have masterfully balanced and blend the often contradictory poles of innovation and tradition. He's widely considered as one of the most groundbreaking and influential saxophonists of his generation. He's also developed a unique voice as a composer and as a conceptualist, concentrating his efforts on perfecting a fine mix between Latin American folkloric music and jazz. He was born and raised in San Juan, Puerto Rico. He has built a distinguished career as a leader, releasing 12 albums under his own name, and he's recorded and toured with the likes of the SF Jazz Collective, Charlie Haden, Fred Hirsch, Kenny Wheeler, the Village Vanguard Orchestra, Kurt Elling, just to name a few. The list goes on and on and on. He's one of my personal musical heroes, and it's a pleasure for me to welcome Mr. Miguel Zenón to the podcast. Miguel, so good to have you.
Thank you, Jesse. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here, man. Thanks for having. Thanks for the invitation, and I want to say hello to everyone who's listening. Really, really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, man. So when I moved to Boston in 2008 for my very first semester at Berkeley, a friend of mine there, I remember him coming up to my dorm room, and he said, I have this like all this music here, and he started rattling off a whole bunch of names of like alto players, like, yeah, you need to check out Jaleel Shaw, and you need to check out Tim Green, and you need to check out Miguel Zenón. And I'm like, who are these guys? I had no idea. It was my first time like away from home. And so at that point I was turned on to what you were doing and your music. And I think the very first album I heard was like Ceremonial. I think it was that one. And since then, I started to check out your music, and I've been following you for a very long time, maybe over 10 years now. And yeah, definitely over 10 years. So it's been a real pleasure to listen to your music and your writing, and just kind of see your trajectory of your career. But then also, just the couple of times that I reached out to you via email or whatever, you're just so gracious in your responses with sharing your music and so on. So it's a pleasure to have you, and I'm excited to get into this conversation. So let's begin right at the beginning. How did you begin playing the saxophone?
All right. So growing up in Puerto Rico, there's a lot of music around, and music is really present, like, and the Caribbean is like that, Latin America is like that.
Yeah.
So I was kind of attracted to music early, and eventually someone mentioned the possibility of auditioning for this specialized music school that goes from a grade, like 7th grade to 12th grade. It's a really good music school in Puerto Rico called Escuela Libre de Música. It's also the same music school that, for example, David Sanchez attended and a bunch of other musicians that come out of Puerto Rico. So I took the test and I was accepted. So I got there the first day, and for some reason I had in my mind that I wanted to play the piano, but a lot of people obviously felt the same way when I got there. all the piano slots were taken. So I had to choose something else, and it was like, guitar, viola, those were the options, oboe, and I don't remember what the other one was. And saxophone.
Yeah.
And of course, out of all those options for me, saxophone was the one that I was most familiar with. Sound-wise, I would see it, people playing it in bands, or you could see it on TV or pop music or whatever. So it was kind of like, okay, so I'll I'll go with that.
Yeah.
It's kind of by chance, really. I mean, eventually, obviously, it grew up me, but I think at that point, I kind of wanted to play something, not a specific. I just wanted to play something. It was like more about finding some kind of vehicle than about what that vehicle was going to be.
Yeah. And did you come from a musical family?
Not necessarily. My parents, they both like music very much. My father played a little percussion, kind of like amateur
Yeah.
percussion. He played little steel pans too. But
Oh,
I
okay.
never grew up with musicians around me.
Okay.
What's interesting is that eventually I realized once I became a musician later on that I had an uncle who played bass and another uncle who played saxophone, but I never saw them play. It was kind of like in the
Right,
DNA,
right.
it was in there embedded.
Yeah, cool. And so you went to the performing arts school what age?
So I started there when I was 11,
Okay.
and I went to school. I was there for 6 years, so from 11
Mm-hmm.
to 17. Yeah.
Right. And at what point during that journey did you discover jazz?
So my training there was all classical.
Mm-hmm.
So it was all classical saxophone. Basically, all the time that I was there. I would say maybe when I was about 14, 15, and I started playing some professional gigs, like playing
Mm-hmm.
salsa and some dance music.
Yep.
Uh, some of my friends started talking about people like Charlie Parker or Miles Davis and passing around tapes in school,
Yeah.
like cassette tapes back then.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh, um, and it's interesting because a lot of people think about jazz and they think about improvisation, but improvisation is kind of universal. A lot of
Yeah.
music, improvisation, especially if it's folklore, have some improvisation in it.
Mm-hmm.
But what I found in jazz that was really unique to me was this combination of improvisation within a certain a context of where you mix something that's really like heartfelt with something that's intellectual at the same time.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
the element of theory, the element of having something that has a certain level of complexity, that really
Yeah.
attracted me. Really
Okay.
attracted me. So it kind of opened the door, and I think up to that point, I had never really considered being a musician. Up to that point, I was thinking I was going to do something else. But jazz really kind of changed my life. Once I discovered that, I was like, okay, so that's what I want to do.
Right.
That's what I want to try to do.
Okay. And so now let's fast forward that you discover jazz and decide that that's what you want to do. Um, at at what age did you move to the US?
Right. So it was kind of a long process. So obviously, when I decided that I wanted to to be a musician, my family they didn't welcome that right away. They're like, "Oh, you want to be a musician? What are you gonna do for money?" And like blah blah blah. So and I come from like a really working class family. By
Okay.
that point, my parents had been separated, so my father was living in New York, my mom was in Puerto Rico,
Okay.
and there was no way they could pay for me to go to college, especially to go to Boston, which is where I wanted to go to
Yeah.
Berkeley.
Yeah.
So from the point that I graduated high school, I kind of had my mind made up. I was like, I really want to try to do this.
Yeah.
So I went through this period of about a year and a half. I graduated in '94. So
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't until early '96 that I was able to go to Boston. And during that time, I basically played a lot of gigs, saved a lot of money,
Mm-hmm.
tried to patch together a bunch of different scholarships from here and there.
Yeah.
And once I had enough to pay tuition and a plane ticket, I basically jumped on a plane and went. And it was one of those leaps of faith because I
Yeah.
didn't really know. I had never lived outside of Puerto Rico. I didn't know what to expect.
Right.
But, I felt that if I really wanted to do this, it was a step that I needed to take.
Mm-hmm.
So I jumped in it and it's been that ever since.
Yeah. You know, as someone myself who like left Trinidad to like pursue a career in music, like the idea of making that jump to pursue
Hmm.
your dreams is it's a big deal. And I think
Yep.
when you're doing it, you're not really quite sure what's gonna happen, and you can
Yep.
only make sense of all of that like looking back.
Of course. Of
And
course.
so if you were to look back over the years of like, so you begin to play the saxophone, you moved to the States and you were studying at Berkeley. what was some of the pivotal moments for you looking back now, whether it was like finding artistic direction, or whether it was like personal development moments for you, you know?
Right. So definitely my time in Boston was really crucial for me. Not only because, I was coming from Puerto Rico and I was coming from a really small place.
Mm-hmm.
Up to that point, I had really good musical training, like good, ear training, saxophone, all that stuff. I could read it well,
Mm-hmm.
but I had never had, like, for example, someone sit me down and say, this is what jazz is, or
Right.
this is jazz harmony, or jazz history, or this is what, jazz, this is what you need to do. No one told me that. I was kind of doing it on my own.
Yeah.
So getting to Berkeley, that was definitely a big deal because it was the first time that I had someone like showing me those things.
Mm-hmm.
But even more importantly, I had people around me that most of them were much better than I was, and they had the same interests. They were my age, they all wanted to play and learn. I went to school with Julio Shaw, and I went to school with Avishai Cohen, trumpet player. It was like all these people were there.
Yeah.
With me, and like, we were challenging each other. Jeremy Pelt was there too, trumpet player. So we're all kind of there together, building of each other. And another thing that was important of my time in Boston is that I got to meet one of my mentors, one of my heroes up to that point, and one of my mentors now, Danilo Perez, the pianist from Panama, who up to that point was really one of the figures that I looked up to, because I remember being in Puerto Rico and seeing what Danilo and David Sanchez were doing with their music and thinking, that's kind of what I want. I see these Latin American musicians really going out there and playing jazz, but at the same time being connected to the roots and not being afraid to let that show in their music and playing. Mm-hmm. So meeting Danilo was a big deal. He like I was saying, I mean, he really just took me under his wing, not just me, but a lot of other musicians like myself. Opened my eyes to possibilities, and then eventually moving to New York and connecting with David in the same way. Yeah. So I would say connecting with both of them, it was a big deal for me because, like I said, it really, it showed me what the possibilities were, and really, helped me center in a road of saying, okay, so this is my goal. This is what I want to strive for.
Mm-hmm. That's great, man. And I mean, you've done a lot of amazing things throughout your career and accomplished a lot over the last really 2 decades. And so what would you say are some of the highlights of your career, really?
Oh man, it's that's hard to say. That's hard to say. I mean, I've taken it really slow, to be honest. I mean, when I went to school, I never really considered like this stuff about making CDs and all this stuff. I mean, now it's funny because now for younger musicians, it's more common. Like you just kind of, okay, so I have a few tunes, you go to a studio, you record them. Back then, for me, I was just basically just trying to learn tunes, trying to learn some solos, trying to learn how to play. It never even crossed my mind, writing music, having my own thing. Mm-hmm. So it was a long process, I think for me, one thing that I really, that I feel was really important in terms of my development is getting to play with other people and getting to play with people who I admired and people who I felt would challenge me, especially older musicians. So obviously playing with Danilo and David and getting to play with people like Charlie Haden, the SF Jazz group and Bobby Hutcherson. And I mean, those are experiences that go beyond, what you would learn in school and in the classroom, and I feel that if it hadn't been for that, the platform for me to have my own ideas and my own projects wouldn't have really been as solid, as I would say as developed. I felt like once I started making my own records and having my own groups, I had enough experience playing with other people that I was okay, because this is kind of what I want to do, and this is how I want my music to be presented. So it was kind of a mix. I mean, another thing I would mention in terms of a highlight is through playing with David's band and kind of going through the ranks like that, I got a chance to connect with Branford Marsalis early on.
To his label at one point, right?
Yeah, and Branford, he was like basically putting together this label. He was like, "Man, do you want to be on the label?" And at first, when he asked me, I was like, yeah, sure. You know, he was like, I'm thinking about doing this in a couple of years. I'm gonna connect. And I was like, yeah, right. You know. And then when he actually reached out and provided that platform, that was a big deal for me because obviously Branford is Branford, but also the platform he provided at that time for me was perfect because he was like, you know, we're going to give you this platform, we're going to give you the visibility and you know all of our resources, but we're basically going to let you do whatever you want musically. Yes. So it was kind of a blessing in that sense, and it definitely opened up a lot of doors.
Which album was that again that you recorded in his?
So I actually recorded 5 albums on his label.
Really?
So
okay.
Ceremonial,
right.
Jíbaro,
right.
Awake, Esta Plena, and
yes.
Alma Dentro.
Yes, I'm seeing the logo now on the CD. I'm seeing
the Marsalis Music is the name of the label.
Yes. Okay. You kind of talked about you being your experience with playing with other musicians really helping you to even launch your own platform and your own band and really inform that process. I firmly believe that the Miguel Zenón quartet is probably one of the best quartets in the world ever. Because the music that you write is very I think you hinted at this early on. One of the things that attracted you to jazz was the idea of there being some complexity or in an idea, but then the idea of it having some soul and being able to improvise, put those two ideas together. I feel like if the Miguel Zenón quartet really represents that idea really well, and the band sounds extremely well rehearsed. I mean, obviously you have a bunch of stellar musicians in the band, but I would like to what was that like? I know that some of the lineup changed a little bit from different projects. You started off with Antonio Sanchez on drums and phrase, and then Henry Cole joined the band. How did you guys rehearse? And how did you get to the point? Obviously, it's over a decade now that the band is together. But just kind of talk about your quartet, how you put the band together, and like your process of like rehearsing, workshopping music, and then like creating records and so on.
Yeah, so I mean, the band came together as a workshop sort of band. You know, I knew Antonio and I went to school together at Berkeley, so I knew Antonio from then, and we kind of moved to New York sort of at the same time. We were playing with some of the same bands. I met Hans, the bassist, while playing with David Sanchez's group back then, in the late 90s, early 2000s. And then Hans and Luis Perdomo went to school together at Manhattan School, so there were all these connections. And I knew Luis was playing from, just seeing him play and really admired him. So basically we just started getting together, and everyone would bring tunes, and we would play standards and just getting together to try out things. And we did that enough times that we sort of developed a repertoire. And then I said, okay, so maybe let's go play a gig. And then we played a few gigs. And then once I felt good, I was like, okay, so I think we have enough tunes that I could go into a studio and make an album. So I made this album called Looking Forward for this Fresh Sound New Talent label in Spain, which was my first record. And that's kind of how I got it. I mean, like I said, I wasn't really thinking about, okay, let me put a band together and have my own thing. It was kind of more like, we got together as a workshop, and then once we started playing more and more, I started writing more and more music. And it was always this thing where, like, I always felt that, if I could find guys who were like minds in the sense that we could kind of hear things similar and have a lot of the similar backgrounds and similar experiences, it would be kind of like a really sort of seamless process. And that's kind of how it was, because with this band and ever since Henry joined the band, I mean, Henry, he's the most recent member of the band, and he joined in 2005. So we've been playing together for like 15 years with Henry Cole on drums. And I always felt that, we think in very, very similar ways, especially the way we think about rhythm and the way rhythm is organized, but also in terms of the music that we're familiar with and we recognize. We also think in similar ways, in the sense that, for example, if we made an album focused on Plano music or something that had to do with Latin American music, Like I would never feel like I had to explain, oh, this is how this rhythm goes, or this are the accents, you know. Like they just know because they've checked out that music as well and they're familiar, you know. So I feel in that sense that it's become this really natural thing, and also because I've been playing with the same folks for a long time, and I know the way they play, and I know the kind of things they do really well, and I know that they have a certain amount of compromise with their band too. So I never feel like, you know, I'm gonna write this and they're not gonna check it out. They're not gonna be ready when we play it. I mean, it's always, we have this sort of process where I write something, I send it to them in advance, and then when we get together to rehearse, like they basically already checked it out. You know, it's more about learning to play together and then taking it on the road. So it's become, I mean, it's become this really sort of seamless process, the way we put music together. I mean, it's funny because you mentioned rehearsal. We do rehearse, but I don't feel that we rehearse that much. I feel more like by the time we get to rehearsal, everyone's done their homework enough with the music that we can kind of come together and be familiar with each other.
Something else.
Yes, exactly.
That's amazing. Okay. So we've talked a lot about, you know, your beginnings, the beginning of your career, and some things that were important to you. So this next segment, I like to call it defining your ground. You know, the name of the podcast is Keep Taking Ground, Saxophone Podcast. So what have you been in pursuit of? Or I would ask the other way, what are some of the things that you value or have valued over the years as a saxophone player, as a composer?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing that I definitely think about a lot, and this is something that it was probably like after college, you know, like, you know, I went through college and trying to learn all the hip stuff to play and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But I think afterwards realized that I have never really spent a lot of time focusing on ways to produce sound, you know, and what it was about sound and my own sound that I wanted to get to. And I feel that ever since then, I mean, pretty much for the last, I don't know, 20 years or so, it's been my sort of one of my focal points to try to figure out how to deal with sound and what it is that I'm looking for in my sound. You know, how is it I'm going to get there? So I spent a lot of time conceptualizing, a lot of time working on it myself, be it from the technical, kind of more physical side of it, you know, how your body kind of reacts to the instrument, to the personality part of it, and trying to balance the two of them. And then the other thing I think about a lot, and those who know me know this, that I think about rhythm a ton, you know, both as a composer, but also as a player. You know, I think about ways to make rhythm a priority, you know, being in terms of the way I organize my phrases, or the way I think about subdivision, or the way I write music. It's something that's always attracted me. I mean, I could think even before I even played the saxophone, I was attracted to the idea of how it felt to organize, put a rhythm together and feel it, and feel the little nuances and the little cracks. So it's definitely something that I think about a bunch too.
Yeah, I mean, that just hearing you say it that obviously comes through your music, and I'd like us to delve into that a little bit more in a second. Was there anything creatively, or maybe anything about anything else besides sound that you've been like in pursuit of? Even conceptually, you know.
Yeah. Of course, yeah. You know, I mean, this is something also that I've come to realize from playing and experiencing music, especially with older musicians. You know, like I got to be around Bobby Hutcherson, Charlie Haden. You know, like masters. You know, master musicians who, by the time I started playing with them, they've been playing for 50 years. You know, and playing with everybody. And you know, there's something I came to realize after spending a lot of time with them, is that there's a certain level of freedom that they attained, where, you know, it was you know, and a lot of people say this a lot when in reference to great musicians, like when they say, like, it doesn't matter the situation it doesn't matter what they play, it's always gonna work and it's gonna sound good. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So that's how I felt when I was playing with them. It's like
Okay.
they were just breathing the music, you know. And it's like that level of freedom where it was just like it didn't matter. It didn't matter complexity. It didn't matter whatever it was. They were gonna impact the music
Yeah.
and just be free within it.
Yeah.
So once I saw that, I was like, that's what I want. You know,
Right.
that I want to get there someday. I want to be able to feel that. And I realized a lot of it has to do uh, with ego. You know, and letting go of ego. You know, I think as you get older, ego gets smaller in a way. You know, and you are less preoccupied with the idea of like making an impression, right?
Yes.
So I think these musicians they said all they had to say. They weren't worried about that anymore. So it was more about letting go and just kind of like flowing through the music. I mean, this is something that's been on my mind ever since. That's kind of like lifetime goal. You know, that's kind of I want to get to that place someday.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really powerful idea of really managing your ego to as like a core part of a place to begin, like personal work, so that you could continue to like grow, you
Yep.
know, personally, musically, creatively. And I can see how like having the opportunity to work with older musicians who were already at that stage in their career could have like helped you to focus in on that. So how would you say that that idea of pursuing like freedom um musically, creatively influence like your daily practice?
It's interesting, you know, because I usually organize my practice pretty systematically.
Okay.
You know, I'm pretty like organized about the order of things that I'm going to do and the
Okay.
amount of time that I'm going to spend on each sort of subject. You know,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but I
And
would
just
say,
sorry to cut you, Miguel, but just out of curiosity, I think everybody that's listening right now is gonna want to know like how many hours a day does Miguel Zenón practice?
well, I mean, that's another thing that happens with age and responsibility. I definitely practice a lot less now than I was in
Okay.
college than I did when I was in college.
Okay.
But I like to get my hours. You know, I think
Mm-hmm.
on a good day I could get 3 or 4 hours, and I
Cool.
feel good about that. You know.
Yeah.
Uh, but then taking advantage, it was also for me, it's about taking advantage of time, you know. So, like the
Yes.
time that I have to practice, I'm going to try to get my stuff in,
Yes.
try to get my sound, try to get my technique, try to get
Mm-hmm.
my creative exercises, my language, all that stuff, some classical repertoire, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But that is something that I've started working on a lot, especially I would say probably over the last decade or so, is trying to find ways to be a little more in control of what I'm doing creatively, right?
Okay.
And putting that within my practice routine. So,
Mm-hmm.
like when I practice, putting myself in uncomfortable situations where I could say, okay, so I want to practice and I want to, and this is going to be like a rule. I'm not going to go over this register. I'm not going to play
Yes.
more than this amount of notes in a row,
Mm-hmm.
also notes in a row, or I'm not going to play this rhythm at the beginning of a bar, and sort of creating this sort of like situational scenarios where I have to like deal with certain obstacles. And
Yes.
I feel that gives me more of a almost like a more like a wider perspective
Mm-hmm.
of what I'm doing. Because I think a lot of what happens, especially us, like horn players, where we play, you know, instruments, we can only play one note at a time. So a lot of times it's like we're really inside of ourselves. You know, it's like we play and it's like inside of what we're doing. And I
Mm-hmm.
feel like the more I get outside of that and I can see it from a wider perspective, I
Right.
gain a little more control, you know,
Mm-hmm.
because then I can say, okay, so this I can take this way, or I already did this. Let me try to push this in another direction,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. So I've been spending a lot of time working on that in practice, you know, whereas like I'll create situations or I will spend some time just improvising around a motif or in a meter or a key or something that's very specifically challenging at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in that way you're using the idea of restrictions and narrowing your focus on one thing and going deep within that one thing to
Yeah.
then achieve freedom when you're playing music. I mean, there's a really good, I think, Miles Davis quote where he says, I'm probably going to mess up the quote, but it goes something like, practice sober and play drunk. Something like that, you
Yeah,
know?
of course. Like you're focused in practice and relax when you play. Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's interesting. Yeah, I mean it's true. I mean it's true. It's like your practice and this is something I remember going to school and you probably ran into George Gershon when you were up in Boston.
Yeah.
And he was one of those guys that would always say like, you know, like you shouldn't play when you practice. Practice is like practice and then playing is playing. You know, playing
Yeah.
is like you're in the moment, you're reacting to what's there. So you
Yeah.
practice in order to have control so you can react to situations, you know. So that's
Yeah.
kind of how I feel now.
Yeah, you know, and one of the other things with that too is that like something that I've been really trying to be aware of now is that, you know, one of the things I experience like when I'm playing with other people is that sometimes I get so hyper focused on like changes or like time or like articulation or trying to say something hip, you know, that you really, I really feel like if I'm not being in the moment
Mm-hmm.
and reacting with what everybody else is saying. So I've been
Mm-hmm.
really trying to be intentional about um, just like using drones at the beginning of like my practice routine to
Mm-hmm.
just try to connect with what I'm hearing and just
Right.
playing that. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that has been really helping me to like not think about the technique or the finger so much and just connect with an idea. And
I
I think
see.
that, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and that's really been helping me to like when I spill over into playing with other people too, where
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm really trying to be in the moment and
Yeah.
listen, you know. Um, yeah, man. So
Yeah,
you
another way to think about this, and this is something that comes to mind all the time for me,
yeah,
is that, you know, like what I'm trying to get to when I hear musicians that I like, I feel like they're not afraid not afraid of taking risk, you know? Like they're not afraid to fail, you know what I mean?
yeah,
So it's
yeah,
like that moment where like you get to a point where like, man, I could just basically just try anything
yeah,
just to see what happens, you know?
right,
And get to a point where like you can push things here and there and just kind of like, you know, if you see a bridge, you just jump in there and see what, you know, what's there. It's like you kind of exploring, and that's something that I've been kind of working towards, so that I can feel like I can get to a point where like I can just try things, you know, without
yeah,
being afraid of what's gonna happen.
yeah, yeah. And you know, you mentioned the idea of you know you being intentional about working on rhythm, the rhythmic element of your playing. And so for this next part of our conversation here, I'd like us to just delve a little bit deeper into your rhythmic concept.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, how have you worked on rhythm both from like a compositional point of view, but then also like as an improviser?
So a lot of what I practice with this stuff is basically like going back and forth, like
Yes.
going from this and actually doing this. You know, when I practice it, I do it over a tune. Like let's
Yeah.
say.